All right, here we go. Welcome to Kitty Pet Drama, or is it Cat Chat? Perhaps we are back in the Roblox version of Warrior Cats. I am slowly working my way through the audiobooks. We're in book two, Fire and Ice, where we follow Firepaw's journey now that he's Fireheart. Always reminds me of Braveheart. And yeah, we follow his adventures as he becomes a clan warrior, maybe a clan leader. We'll see where it goes. In the story so far, he's brought back a clan that was um, banished or thrown out of their land, and a little bit of a conflict on the way back. A cat died, and what else is going on? Oh yeah, he's now training the young apprentices in the skills of becoming a clan cat. So we'll just get on with it, shall we? I'll shut up and I'll bring in the story from Sound SoundCloud. Thank you, Susanna Randall, for uploading the second book, Warriors Fire and Ice by Erin Hunter, for educational purposes only, um, not for resale or distribution. Let's go.
Felt a bit hurt. They had been shown ThunderClan's hunting grounds together as apprentices. He would have liked to do it together again as mentors. But if Greystripe wanted to be by himself, then Fireheart could hardly blame him. Fine, he mewed. I'll see you later. We can share a mouse and compare apprentices. That'd be good, Greystripe meowed. Fireheart crept out of the den. The air outside was even colder. His breath swirled from his muzzle like smoke. He shivered, ruffling out his fur, and stretched one leg at a time. The ground under his paws felt like stone as he trotted over to the apprentice's den. Cinderpaw was fast asleep inside a fluffy gray heap that rose and fell as she breathed. Cinderpaw? Fireheart called quietly, and the little gray cat lifted her head at once. Fireheart backed out, and in a moment Cinderpaw bounded from the den, wide awake and enthusiastic.
What are we doing today?
She mewed, looking up at him with her ears pricked.
I thought I'd take you on a tour of ThunderClan territory. Will we see the Thunderpath?
Asked Cinderpaw eagerly.
Yes, we will,
Fireheart replied. He couldn't help thinking Cinderpaw would be disappointed when she saw what a dirty, stinking place it was. Are you hungry? He asked, wondering if he should tell her to eat first.
No,
Cinderpaw shook her head.
Oh, okay. We'll eat later,
Fireheart meowed.
Well, follow me. Yes, Fireheart.
The young cat looked up at him, her eyes sparkling. The pang of sadness that had been lingering in Fireheart's stomach since talking with Greystripe was swept away by a warm feeling of pride. He turned and padded toward the camp entrance. Cinderpaw raced past him and charged through the gorse tunnel. Fireheart had to break into a run to catch up.
I thought I said follow me,
he called as she scrambled up the side of the ravine.
But I want to see the view from the top,
Cinderpaw protested. Fireheart leaped after her. He overtook her easily, climbed to the top, and sat washing a forepaw, keeping an eye on her as she scrambled from rock to rock. By the time she reached the top of the camp ravine, she was panting, but no less enthusiastic.
Look at the trees. They look like they're made from moonstone,
she mewed breathlessly. She was right. The trees below them sparkled white in the sunshine. Fireheart took a deep breath of cold air.
You should try to save your energy, he warned. We have a long way to go today. Oh, yes, okay. Which way now?
She kneaded the ground with impatient paws, ready to dart away into the woods.
Follow me,
meowed Fireheart. He narrowed his eyes playfully.
And this time I do mean follow.
He led the way to a trail along the edge of the ravine into the sandy hollow where he had learned to hunt and fight. "This is where most of our training sessions will be held," he explained. During Greenleaf, the trees that circled the clearing filtered the sunshine into a warm, dappled light. Now, cold daylight streamed down onto the frozen red earth. "A river ran here many moons ago. A stream still flows beyond that rise there," meowed Fireheart, pointing with his muzzle. "It's dry most of the summer. That's where I caught my first prey." "What did you catch?" Cinderpaw didn't wait for an answer. "Will the stream be frozen? Let's look and see if there's ice." She charged down into the hollow and headed toward the rise. "You'll see it another time," Fireheart called. But Cinderpaw kept running, and Fireheart had to race after her. He stopped beside her at the top of the rise, and together they looked down at the stream. Ice had formed at the edges, but the speed of the water as it slid over its sandy bed had stopped it from freezing over completely. "You wouldn't catch much there now," mewed Cinderpaw. "Except fish, maybe." The sight of the spot where he had caught his first prey filled Fireheart with happy memories. He watched Cinderpaw stand at the edge of the stream and crane her neck to peer into the black water. "If I were you, I'd leave fishing to River Clan," Fireheart warned her. "If they like getting their fur wet, then let them. I prefer dry paws." Cinderpaw padded restlessly around in a circle. "What now?" Her excitement and his own apprentice memories filled Fireheart with energy. He bounded away, calling over his shoulder, "The owl tree!" Cinderpaw charged after him, her short, fluffy tail sticking out behind her. They crossed the stream over a fallen tree Fireheart had used many times before. "There are stepping stones farther down, but this is a quicker route. Be careful, though." The pale white trunk was stripped of its bark. "It gets slippery when it's wet or icy." He let Cinderpaw cross first, keeping close behind in case she lost her paw hold. The stream wasn't particularly deep, but it would be cold as ice, and Cinderpaw was still too small to cope with the soaking. She crossed the log easily, and Fireheart felt a glow of pride as he watched his apprentice jump down onto the forest floor at the far end. "Well done," he purred. Cinderpaw's eyes shone. "Thanks," she mewed. "Now, where's this owl tree?" "This way." Fireheart bounded away through the undergrowth. The ferns had turned brown since Greenleaf. By the end of leaf fall, they would be flattened by rain and wind, but now they still stood tall and crisp. Fireheart and Cinderpaw wove their way beneath the arching fronds. Ahead, a massive oak towered above the surrounding trees. Cinderpaw tipped her head back, looking for the top. "Does an owl really live here?" she mewed. "Yes," replied Fireheart. "Can you see the hole in the trunk up there?" Cinderpaw narrowed her eyes to peer through the branches. "How do you know it's not a squirrel hole?" "Smell," Fireheart told her. Cinderpaw sniffed loudly, but shook her head, her eyes curious as she looked up at Fireheart. "I'll show you what squirrels smell like another time," Fireheart meowed. "You won't smell any around here. No squirrel would dare make its nest so near an owl hole. Look at the ground. What do you see?" Cinderpaw looked down, puzzled. "Leaves?" "Try burrowing under the leaves." The forest floor was carpeted with brown oak leaves, crisp with frost. Cinderpaw began snuffling among them and then shoved her nose in right up to her ears. When she sat up, there was something the size and shape of a pine cone in her mouth. "Yuck! Smells like crow food," she spat. Fireheart purred with amusement. "You knew it was there, didn't you?" "Bluestar played the same trick on me when I was an apprentice. You'll never forget the stench." "What is it?" "An owl pod," Fireheart explained. He remembered what Bluestar had told him. "Owls eat the same prey as us, but they can't digest the bones and fur, so their bellies roll the leftovers into pods and they spit them out. If you find one of those under a tree, it means you found an owl." "Why would you want to find an owl?" squeaked Cinderpaw in alarm. Fireheart's whiskers twitched as he looked into her wide eyes, as blue as her mother's. Frostfur must have told her the elder's tale of how owls carried off young kits who strayed from their mother's side.
Owls get a better view of the forest than we do. On windy nights, when scents are hard to follow, you can look out for owls and follow where they hunt. Cinderpaw's eyes were still wide, but the fear had left them, and she nodded. She does listen sometimes, Fireheart thought with relief.
Where next?
Mewed Cinderpaw. The Great Sycamore, Fireheart decided. They traveled through the woods as the sun rose into the pale blue sky, crossing a two-leg path and another tiny stream. Eventually, they arrived at the sycamore tree.
It's huge,
Cinderpaw gasped. Small Ear says he climbed to the top branch when he was an apprentice, Fireheart meowed.
No way,
Mewed Cinderpaw. Mind you, when Small Ear was an apprentice, this tree was probably only a sapling, Fireheart joked. He was still gazing up when a rustling sound behind him told him Cinderpaw had dashed off again. He sighed and chased after her through the bracken. His nose detected a familiar scent that made him nervous. Cinderpaw was heading toward Snake Rocks. Adders. Fireheart picked up his pace. He emerged from the trees and looked around anxiously. Cinderpaw was standing on a boulder at the bottom of the steep rocky slope.
Come on, I'll race you to the top,
she mewed. Fireheart froze, horror-struck, as she crouched, ready to spring onto the next boulder. Cinderpaw, get down from there! He yowled. He held his breath as Cinderpaw turned and scrambled down again. She stood trembling, her fur on end, as Fireheart rushed over to her. This place is called Snake Rocks, he puffed. Cinderpaw looked up at him, her eyes huge.
Snake Rocks?
Adders live up there. A bite from one of those would kill a cat as small as you. Fireheart gave Cinderpaw a quick lick on top of her head. Come on, let's have a look at the Thunderpath. Cinderpaw stopped shaking at once.
The Thunderpath?
Yep, meowed Fireheart. Follow me. He led Cinderpaw through the ferns, along a trail that skirted Snake Rocks, and took them to the part of the forest where the Thunderpath cut through like a hard gray river of stone. Fireheart kept one eye on Cinderpaw as they peered out from the edge of the forest. He could see from her twitching tail that Cinderpaw was desperate to creep forward and sniff the Thunderpath ahead of them. A familiar roar was beginning to ruffle his ear fur, and he could feel the ground trembling beneath his paws. Stay where you are, he warned. There's a monster coming. Cinderpaw opened her mouth a little.
Yuck,
She mewed, screwing up her nose and flattening her ears. The rumbling noise was coming closer, and a shape appeared on the horizon.
Is that a monster?
She mewed. Fireheart nodded. Cinderpaw unsheathed her claws to grip the earth as the monster roared closer. She shut her eyes tight as it charged past, stirring the air around them into a storm of wind and thunder. She kept her eyes shut until the noise had faded into the distance. Fireheart shook his head to clear his scent glands. Sniff the air, he meowed. Can you smell anything apart from the Thunderpath stench? He waited while Cinderpaw lifted her head and took several deep breaths. After a few moments, she mewed,
I remember that scent from when Broken Star attacked our camp. And it was on the kits he took when you brought them home. It's Shadow Clan. Is that their territory beyond the Thunderpath?
Yes, Fireheart answered, feeling his fur tingle at the thought of being so close to hostile clan territory. We'd better get out of here. He decided to take Cinderpaw the long way home, past Two-Leg Place, so she could see Tall Pines and the Tree Cup Place. As they padded beneath the thin pine trees, the sense of Two-Leg Place made Fireheart uneasy, even though he'd lived in a place not far from there as a kid. Stay alert, he warned Cinderpaw as she crept along behind him. Two-Legs sometimes walk here with dogs. The two cats crouched under the trees to look at the fences that bordered the Two-Leg territory. The crisp air carried a scent to Fireheart's nose that stirred an odd feeling of warmth inside him, although he didn't know why.
Look!
Cinderpaw pointed with her nose at a she-cat padding across the forest floor. The light brown tabby had a distinctive white chest and white front paws. Her belly was swollen, heavy with unborn kits.
Kitty pet,
Sneered Cinderpaw, her fur fluffed out.
let's chase her out.
Fireheart expected to feel the familiar rush of aggression at the sight of a stranger on ThunderClan territory, but his hackles stayed flat. For some reason he couldn't understand, he knew this cat wasn't a threat. Before Cinderpaw could attack, Fireheart deliberately brushed against a stalk of crunchy bracken. The she-cat looked up, disturbed by the crackling noise. Her eyes widened with alarm. Then she whipped around and set off at a lumbering pace out of the trees. Within moments, she was heaving herself over one of the two-leg fences.
Rats,
complained Cinderpaw.
I wanted to chase her. I bet Brackenpaw will have chased hundreds of things today.
Yeah, but he probably didn't nearly get bitten by an adder, replied Fireheart, twitching his tail at her. Now come on, I'm getting hungry. Cinderpaw followed him through tall pines, grumbling about the pine needles pricking her paws. Fireheart warned her to keep quiet, since there was no undergrowth here to hide in, and he felt every clan cat's discomfort at being in the open. They followed one of the stinking tracks gouged out by the tree-cut monster and stopped at the edge of the tree-cut place. It was silent, as Fireheart knew it would be until next Greenleaf. Until then, only the track marks, deep and wide and frozen into the soil, would remind ThunderClan of the monster that lived in their forest.
All right, thanks for the question. Question is, what is this? This is Warrior Cats from Roblox, based on the Warriors book, a Warriors series of books, large series of books. And we're in the second chapter, Warriors Fire and Ice, listening to the book and exploring the kitty pet world. There we go. That's it.
By the time they arrived back at camp, Fireheart was exhausted. His muscles were still weary from the long journey with WindClan. Cinderpaw looked tired too. She stifled a yawn and padded away to find Brackenpaw. Fireheart spotted Graystripe beckoning to him from beside the nettle clump. Here, I've got you some fresh kill, Graystripe meowed. He hooked a dead mouse with his claw and flung it toward Fireheart. Fireheart caught it in his teeth and lay down next to Graystripe. Good day, he mumbled with his mouth full. Better than yesterday, answered Graystripe. Fireheart glanced up at him, worried, but Graystripe went on. I enjoyed it, actually. Brackenpaw's keen to learn, that's for sure. So is Cinderpaw. Fireheart went back to chewing. Mind you, Graystripe went on with a sparkle in his eye, I keep forgetting I was the mentor and not the apprentice. Me too, Fireheart admitted. They shared tongues until the moon rose and the coldness of the night drove them into their den. Graystripe was snoring within moments, but Fireheart felt strangely awake. The image of the pregnant she-cat kept returning to his mind, and even though he was surrounded by the familiar smells of ThunderClan, her soft kitty pet scent lingered in his nostrils. He fell asleep at last, but his dreams all carried the same scent, until finally he dreamed of his days as a kid. He remembered lying beside his mother's belly, curled in a bed softer than any forest moss, with his brothers and sisters. And still, the scent of the she-cat lingered. Fireheart opened his eyes, suddenly jolted out of his sleep. Of course! The she-cat he had seen in the woods was his sister. Chapter 10. Fireheart woke at dawn with the image of his sister still clear in his mind. He pushed his way out of the den, hoping the routine of the day would distract him. It was another cold, frosty morning. White Storm and Longtail were waiting near the camp entrance, preparing to leave on patrol. Mousefur padded past on her way to join them and greeted Fireheart with a cheery mew. White Storm called for Sandpaw, who came racing out of her den just in time to follow the patrol as it pounded out of the camp. It was a scene Fireheart had watched many times, but for once he didn't yearn to join them as they thundered away into the morning fresh forest. He padded across the clearing, wondering if Cinderpaw was awake yet. Brindleface was just squeezing out of the narrow nursery entrance. A speckled kit followed her, then one more. A third kit, pale gray with darker flecks like the other, tumbled out and fell onto the ground. Brindleface picked it up by its scruff and placed it gently back on its paws. The tenderness of Brindleface's action brought Fireheart's dream flooding back. His mother had probably done the same for him. He knew that Brindleface's fourth kit had died soon after it was born, and she seemed to love the remaining kits even more fiercely now. Fireheart was overwhelmed by a pang of envy at the thought that the other cats here all shared something he did not. They were all clan-born. Fireheart had always been proud of his loyalty to the clan that had taken him in and given him a life he would never have known as a kitty pet. He still felt that loyalty. He would die to protect ThunderClan. But no one in the clan understood or even respected his kitty pet roots. Fireheart felt certain the she-cat he had seen yesterday would. With an ache in his heart, he wondered what memories they might share. Fireheart heard Graystripe's heavy paw steps behind him. He turned to greet his friend, stretching his head to touch Graystripe's nose, and asked, "Could you take Cinderpaw for the day?" Graystripe looked curiously at Fireheart. "Why?" "Oh, it's nothing important," replied Fireheart as casually as he could. "I just wanted to check out something I saw yesterday. Watch out for Cinderpaw, though. She doesn't listen to orders very well. Don't take your eyes off her, or she'll be charging off in every direction." Graystripe's whiskers twitched with amusement. "She sounds like a pawful. Still, it'll be good for Brackenpaw. He never charges off anywhere without thinking about it carefully first." "Thanks, Graystripe." Fireheart bounded away toward the camp entrance before his friend could remember to ask him where he was going. As the two-leg place came into view through the trees, Fireheart dropped into a crouch. He opened his mouth and breathed in the cold morning air. No sign of a ThunderClan patrol, and no two-leg sense either. He relaxed a little. Slowly he approached the two-leg fence where he had seen the she-cat disappear. He hesitated at the bottom and looked around, sniffing the air once more. Then he leaped, landing on a fence post in one easy jump. No two legs to be seen, just an empty garden with its strongly scented plants. Fireheart felt exposed on the post. The branch of a tree hung low overhead. Its leaves had gone, but it would be easier to hide there. Silently, he pulled himself up and lay down to wait, flattening himself against the rough bark. Fireheart could see a swinging flap in the entrance to the two-leg place. He had used one just like it as a kit. He fixed his gaze on the flap, hoping his sister's face would appear at any moment. The sun rose slowly into the morning sky, but Fireheart started to feel cold. The damp branch was drawing the heat from his body. Perhaps the two legs were keeping his sister shut in. After all, her kitting would be soon. Fireheart licked a paw and wondered if he should go back to the camp. Suddenly, he heard a loud clatter. Fireheart looked up and saw his sister pop out through the swinging flap. The fur along his spine rippled with anticipation, and Fireheart fought to stop himself from leaping down into her garden straight away. He knew he would frighten her, as he had done yesterday. He smelled like a forest cat now, not a friendly kitty pet. Fireheart waited until his sister had reached the end of the grass. Then he crept to the tip of the branch and slipped down onto the fence. Quietly, he jumped into the bushes below. The she-cat's scent brought his dream flooding back to him. How could he get her attention without frightening her? Desperately, he searched his mind, trying to think of the name his sister had been given. He could remember only his own kitty pet name. Fireheart called softly from the bushes. "It's me, Rusty." The she-cat stopped dead and looked around. Fireheart took a deep breath and crept out from the bushes. The cat's eyes widened with terror. Fireheart knew how he must appear to her, lean and wild, with the sharp forest scents on his pelt. The she-cat raised her hackles and hissed ferociously. Fireheart couldn't help feeling impressed by her courage. In a flash, he remembered his sister's name. "Princess! It's me, Rusty, your brother. Do you remember me?" Princess remained tense. Fireheart guessed she was wondering how this strange cat could know these names. He dropped into a submissive crouch, hope soaring in his chest as he watched his sister's expression slowly change from fear to curiosity.
Rusty?
Princess sniffed the air, wide-eyed and wary. Fireheart took a careful step forward. Princess did not move, so Fireheart edged closer. Still, his sister held her ground until Fireheart was standing only a mouse length away.
You don't smell like Rusty,
she mewed. I don't live with two legs anymore. I've been living in the forest with ThunderClan. I carry their scent now. She's probably never heard of the clans, Fireheart realized, remembering his own innocence before he'd met Graystripe in the woods. Princess stretched her nose forward and rubbed her muzzle cautiously along his cheek.
But our mother's smell is still there,
she murmured, half to herself. Her words filled Fireheart with happiness, until her eyes narrowed and she took a step backward, her ears flat with distrust.
Why are you here?
She asked. I saw you yesterday in the woods, Fireheart explained. I had to come back to speak with you.
Why?
Fireheart looked at her in surprise.
Because you're my sister.
Surely she must feel something for him. Princess studied him for a moment. To Fireheart's relief, her guarded expression lifted.
You're very thin,
she mewed critically.
Thinner than a kitty pet, maybe, but not thin for a forest cat,
Fireheart replied.
Your scent was in my dreams last night. I dreamed of you and our brothers and sister and...
Fireheart paused.
Where is our mother?
She's still with her housefolk,
answered Princess.
What about...
Princess guessed what he was going to ask.
Our brothers and sisters? Most of them live near here. I see them in their gardens from time to time.
They sat silently for a moment. Then Fireheart asked,
Do you remember the soft bedding of our mother's basket?
He felt a flicker of guilt about longing for such kitty pet softness, but Princess purred.
Oh, yes. I wish I could have it for my own kidding.
Fireheart's discomfort faded. It felt good to be able to talk of such a tender memory without shame.
Will this litter be your first?
Princess nodded, uncertainty showing in her eyes. Fireheart felt a wave of sympathy. Even though they were the same age, she seemed to him very young and naive.
You'll be fine, he mewed, remembering Brindleface's kidding. You look as if your two legs treat you well. I'm sure your kits will be healthy and safe.
Princess moved closer to him, pressing her fur against his flank. Fireheart felt his heart swell with emotion. For the first time since he was a kid, he caught a glimpse of what the clan cats must take for granted. The closeness of kinship, a common bond determined by birth and heritage. Suddenly, Fireheart wanted his sister to know about the life he led now.
Do you know about the clans?
Princess gazed at him, mystified.
You mentioned a Thunder Clan?
Fireheart nodded.
There are 4 clans altogether, he went on, the words tumbling out. In the clan, we take care of each other. Younger cats hunt for elders. Warriors protect the hunting grounds from other clans. I trained all Greenleaf to become a warrior. Now I have an apprentice of my own.
Fireheart could see by her bemused expression that his sister couldn't understand everything he was telling her. Yet her eyes brightened with pleasure as he spoke.
It sounds as if you enjoy your life,
she mewed in awe. A two-leg voice called from the house. Fireheart instantly darted under the nearest bush.
I should go,
Princess mewed.
They'll be worried if I don't go back, and I have many tiny mouths to feed. I can feel them moving inside me.
She glanced at her swollen belly, her eyes soft. Fireheart looked out from beneath the bush.
Go then. I have to return to my clan anyway. But I'll come back and see you.
Yes, I'd like that,
Princess called over her shoulder. She was already trotting back toward her two-leg nest.
Goodbye.
See you soon,
Fireheart called. His sister disappeared from view, and he heard the swinging flap slap shut behind her. Once the garden was silent, Fireheart crept through the bushes to the fence. He jumped over it and ran into the forest. Memories of kithood scents crowded his mind, suddenly more real than the scents of the forest around him. Fireheart paused at the top of the ravine and looked down at the ThunderClan camp. He didn't feel ready to go back yet. He was worried that it would all seem strange to him. I'll go and hunt, he thought. Cinderpaw would be safe with Graystripe for a while longer, and the clan would welcome any extra fresh kill. He turned away and headed back into the forest. When he finally returned to camp, he carried a vole and a wood pigeon in his mouth. The sun was setting, and the clan cats were gathering for their evening meal. Graystripe sat alone beside the nettle clump, a fat chaffinch at his paws. Fireheart nodded to him as he padded across the clearing to the pile of fresh kill that had already been collected. Tiger Claw was sitting below the high rock, his amber eyes narrow.
I noticed that Cinderpaw spent the day with Graystripe,
he meowed as Fireheart dropped his catch onto the pile.
Where were you?
Fireheart returned Tiger Claw's gaze. It seemed a good day for hunting. Too good to waste, he replied, his heart thudding in his chest. The clan needs all the fresh kill it can get at the moment. Tiger Claw nodded, suspicion darkening his eyes.
Yes, but we also need warriors. Cinderpaw's training is your responsibility.
I understand, Tiger Claw, Fireheart meowed. He dipped his head respectfully. I'll take her out tomorrow.
Good.
The deputy turned his head and looked around the camp. Fireheart picked up a mouse and carried it over to eat next to Graystripe. Find what you were looking for? Asked Graystripe absently. Yes. Fireheart felt a pang of sorrow for the pain in his friend's eyes. Are you thinking about that River Clan warrior? I do try not to, answered Graystripe quietly. It's just when I'm alone I can't help remembering Barkface's prediction of an unnecessary death and trouble ahead. Here, Fireheart interrupted and pushed his mouse toward Graystripe. That chaffinch looks like it'll be half feathers, and I'm not that hungry. Want to swap? Graystripe shot him a grateful glance, and the two friends exchanged prey and began to eat. As he crunched on the chaffinch, Fireheart scanned the clearing. He could see Sandpaw and Dustpaw outside the apprentice's den. Dustpaw was busy ripping apart a rabbit. Fireheart caught Sandpaw's eye, but she looked away. Cinderpaw lay beside the old tree stump where he'd shared many meals as an apprentice. She was chatting enthusiastically to Brackenpaw, who nodded from time to time while plucking the feathers from a sparrow. Seeing the two young cats, brother and sister, lying together so at ease, reminded Fireheart once more of the princess. And for the first time, the familiar sights of his clan made Fireheart feel uneasy. He had been careful to lick his sister's smell from his fur before returning to camp, but it was her scent that lingered in his nostrils as the sun disappeared over the distant horizon. He had found the closeness he had missed, but it had given shape to a sense of loneliness that, until now, had lain vague and nameless in his heart. Were the deep-rooted memories he shared with Princess stronger than his loyalty to the clan?
Chapter 11.
Another day of sunshine,
Fireheart purred to Graystripe, feeling his flame-colored pelt glow in the weak morning sun. Thanks to the fine weather, he had visited Princess nearly every day recently, slipping away to see her between patrols, hunting, and training sessions. Now he walked with his friend along the short trail to the sandy hollow where Cinderpaw and Brackenpaw would be waiting. Let's hope it stays clear for the rest of Leafbear, Graystripe meowed. Fireheart knew how much his thick-coated friend hated rain. When Graystripe's fur got wet, it clung to him and stayed damp long after Fireheart's shorter fur had dried off. The two warriors arrived at the edge of the hollow just as Cinderpaw pounced on a pile of frosty leaves, sending them flying in all directions. She leaped and twisted to catch one as it fluttered back to the ground. Fireheart and Graystripe glanced at each other, amused. At least Cinderpaw will be warmed up and ready for today's assignment, Graystripe observed. Brackenpaw jumped to his paws and looked up at his mentor, his eyes wide.
Good morning, Graystripe,
He meowed.
What is today's assignment?
A hunting mission, Graystripe told him. He padded down into the hollow, followed by Fireheart.
Where?
Mewed Cinderpaw, dashing toward them.
What are we going to catch?
We're going to Sunning Rocks, Fireheart replied, suddenly sharing her enthusiasm. And we'll catch whatever we can.
I'd like to catch a vole,
declared Cinderpaw.
I've never tasted vole.
I'm afraid everything we catch today goes straight back to the elders, Graystripe warned. But I'm sure if you asked one of them nicely, they'd be happy to share.
Okay,
mewed Cinderpaw.
Which way is Sunning Rocks?
She bounded up one side of the hollow and peered into the forest, her tail sticking straight up. This way, meowed Fireheart, leaping up the opposite side.
Okay.
Cinderpaw raced down the slope across the hollow and up to Fireheart's side, sending fallen leaves flying everywhere. Graystripe leaped up and caught one as it drifted past his nose. He pinned it to the ground with a purr of satisfaction and saw Brackenpaw staring at him. Never miss a chance to practice your hunting skills, Graystripe told him quickly. The four cats made their way along the familiar scent trails to Sunning Rocks. The sun was above the trees by the time they emerged into open territory. Ahead of them, a slope of rock rose out of the soft earth, its smooth surface lined with cracks. The cats had to narrow their eyes as they looked at it. After the shade of the woods, the flat rock face reflected the sun with dazzling glare. This is Sunning Rocks, Fireheart announced, blinking. Come on!
It feels nice,
mewed Cinderpaw as she raced up the stone slope behind him. Fireheart realized she was right. The stone felt comfortingly warm and smooth after the ice-cold forest floor. They rested at the top, where the far side fell away steeply to the forest. Fireheart listened for the gentle bubbling of the river that followed the RiverClan border, flowing down from the uplands. It touched the Sunning Rocks before turning to run deeper into RiverClan territory. He could barely hear it. Perhaps the water was low after the dry weather. Fireheart stretched out, enjoying the warmth of the rock beneath him and the soft heat of the sun on his pelt. He closed his eyes, feeling proud to be lying here, a place where generations of ThunderClan cats had come to warm themselves, and which they had battled hard to keep. Graystripe joined him. Come on, he meowed to the two apprentices. Make the most of the sun while it's here. There are enough cold, damp days ahead of us. The two apprentices lay down beside their mentors and purred as the warmth seeped into their fur.
Is this where Redtail died?
asked Brackenpaw. Yes, Fireheart answered cautiously.
And where Tigerclaw avenged his death by killing Oakheart?
Cinderpaw piped up. Fireheart's fur prickled as he remembered Ravenpaw's account of the fight, that Redtail had been responsible for Oakheart's death, and then Tigerclaw had killed Redtail, the deputy of his own clan. Fireheart pushed away the disturbing thoughts and replied simply, This is the place. The two apprentices fell silent and looked down the slope in awe. Suddenly Fireheart heard a noise. He pricked his ears. Hush, he hissed. What can you hear? The two apprentices strained their ears forward.
I think I can hear some scrabbling,
Brackenpaw whispered. It might be a vole, murmured Graystripe. Can you tell where it's coming from?
Over there,
mewed Cinderpaw, leaping to her paws. The scrabbling noise became more furious and then disappeared. I think it heard you, Fireheart remarked. Cinderpaw looked crestfallen. Brackenpaw purred with amusement at his sister's clumsiness. Never mind, meowed Graystripe. Now you know that it's better to creep up slowly, especially on voles. They're fast.
Sit still and listen, Fireheart advised. Next time we hear something, work out where it is, and then begin to move toward it very slowly. A mouse could probably hear even the rustling of your fur, so let him think it's just the wind blowing across the rock.
All right, I'm taking a little pause in the middle of this hunting part of the story. I gotta check a message, so just give me a sec. Sorry about that. I'm back. Story's back as well. Had to pick up a message.
The cats remained where they were, no one daring to move until they heard the scrabbling sound again. His ears pricked. Fireheart rose and crept forward,
Story's picking
placing
up,
each
actually.
paw
It's picking up.
noiselessly in front of the other until he reached the edge of a small crack that ran across the rock face. He paused. The scrabbling noise continued. Fireheart lunged forward and reached down into the crack with a forepaw. He scooped out a fat vole that had been hiding in the shadows and flung it onto the bright stone. It squealed as it landed, but the hard ground stunned it, and Fireheart finished it off quickly.
Wow.
Mewed Cinderpaw.
I want to do that.
Don't worry, you'll have plenty of chances. For now, let's get back to the forest, meowed Graystripe.
Are we going to catch anything else?
Cinderpaw protested. Did you hear that vole squeal? Meowed Fireheart. Cinderpaw nodded. Well, so did every other creature around here. The prey will be hiding for a while. I should have caught it and killed it before it could make a sound. Graystripe's whiskers twitched with amusement. I wasn't going to say a word, he purred. Fireheart picked up the dead vole in his mouth, and together the cats headed down the slope and began to trek onward through the forest. After the open warmth of Sunning Rocks, the woods seemed chilly, even though Sun High was approaching. Fireheart smelled fresh markers at the RiverClan border. Beyond them, the ground sloped down to meet the river. A leaf fluttered down toward Brackenpaw. The young cat immediately leaped up and caught it between his paws. He landed, looking pleased with himself. Well done, called Graystripe. You'll have no trouble with voles. Brackenpaw looked doubly pleased.
Nice catch, Brackenpaw,
Cinderpaw mewed. She nudged her brother's shoulder with her nose before turning to stare down the wooded slope. The river's quiet today, Fireheart mumbled through his mouthful of vole.
That's because it's frozen,
Mewed Cinderpaw excitedly.
I can see it through the trees.
Fireheart dropped the vole. Frozen? Completely? He stared down the wooded slope. The river glittered at the bottom, frosty and still. Could Cinderpaw be right? Fireheart's paws tingled with excitement. He had never seen the river frozen over.
Can we have a look?
Asked Cinderpaw. Without waiting for an answer, she bounded past the scent markers. Fireheart's excitement turned to panic as he saw the small gray cat disappear into RiverClan territory. He couldn't call after her. He didn't want to alert any RiverClan patrols that might be in the area, but he had to get her back. He left the vole where he'd dropped it and tore after her, Graystripe and Brackenpaw close behind him. They caught up with Cinderpaw at the edge of the river. It was almost totally frozen, apart from a narrow channel of dark water that flowed swiftly between two wide fringes of ice. Fireheart remembered Whiteclaw with a shudder. He was about to suggest they leave when he noticed Graystripe's ears were pricked. Water vole, the Grey Warrior hissed. Sure enough, a small vole was scampering along the ice near the bank. Fireheart glanced at Cinderpaw and Brackenpaw, afraid that they might try to catch this tiny piece of prey. But neither apprentice moved. Fireheart felt relieved for a moment. And then his heart lurched as Graystripe dashed out onto the ice at hunting speed. Come back! Fireheart hissed. It was too late. The ice beneath Graystripe's paws gave a terrifying crack and broke. With a startled yowl, Graystripe fell into the water. He paddled madly for a moment before disappearing into the cold, dark depths of the river. Brackenpaw stared in horror, and Cinderpaw gave a desperate mew. Fireheart didn't quiet her. He was rigid with fear, staring into the water after his friend. Was Graystripe trapped underneath the ice? Fireheart stepped onto the ice. It felt cold and slippery beneath his paws. Impossible to run on. He jumped back onto the bank. Panic gripped him. Then, a blaze of relief as a drenched gray head appeared in the water farther along. But relief turned to alarm as Fireheart saw that Graystripe was being carried downriver, turning and bobbing in the freezing waters. His paws thrashed helplessly, all his instincts to swim thwarted by the fierce current. Fireheart bounded along the bank, forcing his way through the bracken, but Graystripe was swept farther and farther away. Suddenly, Fireheart heard a yowl from the opposite bank and stopped. A slender silver tabby had leaped onto the ice farther downstream. She padded lightly over the frozen sheet and slid into the river ahead of Graystripe. Amazed, Fireheart watched the she-cat swim strongly against the current, holding her position in the icy water with confident churning paws. As Graystripe was swept past, the tabby grabbed a mouthful of his fur between her teeth. But to Fireheart's horror, Graystripe's weight pulled both cats under. He started running again, his eyes fixed on the river. Where were they? Then, a silver-striped head appeared amid the rolling waters, pushing through the waves. The tabby was swimming against the current, dragging Graystripe with her. Fireheart could hardly believe that such a slender cat could swim with such a weight. The tabby grabbed the ice on Fireheart's side of the river with her forepaws, her neck craning awkwardly as she held Graystripe between her teeth. Slipping and sliding, she hauled herself out of the river. Graystripe hung limply in the water, twisting and turning as the current dragged at his fur, but the tabby kept a firm grip. Fireheart slid down the bank, raced across the ice, and skidded to a halt beside her. Without a word, he reached forward and took hold of Graystripe in his teeth. Together, the two cats heaved his soaking body out of the water and dragged him to the safety of the riverbank. Fireheart bent over his friend to see if he was breathing. He felt dizzy with relief as he saw Graystripe's slick gray flank rising and falling. Graystripe coughed and spluttered and spat out a mouthful of river water. Then he lay still. "Graystripe!" Fireheart meowed urgently. "I'm okay," wheezed Graystripe. His mew was breathless but reassuring. Fireheart sighed and sat down. He looked closely at the silver tabby. She carried the scent of RiverClan on her. After seeing her swim, Fireheart wasn't surprised. The tabby returned his gaze coldly, shook herself and sat down, her sides heaving as she got her breath back. Water streamed from her glossy fur as if her pelt were made from duck feathers. Graystripe turned his head and looked at his rescuer. "Thanks," he croaked. "You idiot!" she spat, flattening her ears. "What are you doing in my territory?" "Drowning?" replied Graystripe. The silver tabby flicked her ears, and Fireheart saw a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "Can't you drown yourself in your own territory?" Graystripe's whiskers twitched. "Ah, but who would rescue me there?" he rasped. There was a tiny mew behind Fireheart. He turned to see Cinderpaw crouching by a clump of grass farther up the bank. "Where's Brackenpaw?" he asked. "Just coming," answered Cinderpaw, pointing with her nose. Her brother was creeping nervously along the bank toward them. Fireheart sighed and turned to his friend. "Look, Graystripe, we've got to get out of here." "I know." Graystripe pushed himself to his paws and turned to the silver tabby. "Thanks again." She dipped her head graciously, but hissed, "Hurry! Go now!" She looked over her shoulder. "If my father knew that I'd rescued a ThunderClan intruder, he'd shred me for kit betting." "Why'd you save me, then?" teased Graystripe. The tabby looked away. "Instinct. I couldn't watch any cat drown. Now go away." Fireheart stood up. "Thanks. I'd have missed this furball if he'd drowned." He nudged Graystripe. His friend hadn't even shaken the icy water from his fur, and he was soaked to the skin. "Come on, let's get back to camp. You're freezing." "Okay, I'm coming," Graystripe meowed. But before he followed Fireheart up the slope, he turned back to the silver she-cat. "What's your name?" "Mine's Graystripe."
"Silverstream,"
she replied, and bounded away, back onto the ice and over the channel of water to the far side. Fireheart and Graystripe led their apprentices through the bracken toward the border. Fireheart couldn't help noticing that Graystripe looked back over his shoulder more than once. Cinderpaw noticed too. The little gray cat glanced up, mischief dancing in her eyes.
"What a pretty RiverClan cat she was."
Graystripe gave her a playful cuff around the ear, and she ran on ahead. "Stay with us," Fireheart warned in a loud hiss. They were still in RiverClan territory. He flashed Cinderpaw an angry look as she stopped and waited for them. If it weren't for her, they wouldn't be here at all, and Graystripe wouldn't have nearly drowned. He looked at his wet friend. Even though the Gray Warrior had shaken as much of the water from his fur as he could, his coat was still dripping, and ice was beginning to form on the ends of his whiskers. Fireheart quickened the pace. "Are you okay?" he asked Graystripe.
Fine," replied Graystripe through chattering teeth.
"Sorry,"
mewed Cinderpaw softly as she fell into step behind Fireheart. He sighed. "It's not your fault." He felt weighed down with worry. How were they going to explain this to the clan? No fresh kill for the elders, there wasn't time to go back for the vole now, and a soaked Graystripe. Fireheart shuddered as he thought how close he had come to losing his closest friend. Thank StarClan that Silverstream had been there to save him.
"The stream near the training hollow is still running with water,"
Brackenpaw meowed thoughtfully from the back. "What?" asked Fireheart, puzzled out of his gloomy thoughts.
"The clan will probably assume that Graystripe fell in there," continued the young apprentice. "We could say he was showing us how to catch fish,"
Cinderpaw added. "I'm not sure any cat would believe Graystripe would get his paws wet on purpose in this weather," Fireheart pointed out. "Well, I don't want the rest of the clan to know I had to be rescued by a RiverClan cat," meowed Graystripe with a flash of his old spirit. "And we can't let them know we were in RiverClan's territory again." Fireheart nodded. "Come on," he meowed. "Let's run the rest of the way. It'll help Graystripe warm up." The cats raced across the RiverClan border and past Sunning Rocks. As the sun began to dip behind the treetops, they arrived back outside the camp. Graystripe's fur had dried a little, but frozen droplets hung on his whiskers and tail. Fireheart led the way through the gorse entrance. His heart sank when he saw Tigerclaw sitting in the clearing watching them. The deputy fixed his sharp eyes on Fireheart.
"No fresh kill?" he growled. "I thought you were meant to be teaching these two how to hunt today. You look half drowned, Graystripe. You must have fallen into a river to get that wet."
His nostrils flared and he drew himself up to his full height.
"Don't tell me you've been into RiverClan territory again!"
Chapter 12. Fireheart lifted his head, about to speak, but Cinderpaw beat him to it.
"It's my fault, Tigerclaw."
She stared boldly up at the great tabby.
"We were hunting on the frozen stream by the training hollow, on the bend by the deep pool. Even that bit was frozen. I slipped and Graystripe came to help me, but the ice wasn't thick enough for him, and it cracked and he fell into the water."
Tigerclaw looked into her clear, bright eyes as she added,
"It really is deep there. Fireheart had to pull him out."
Fireheart cringed, remembering how he had stood motionless with terror at the sight of Graystripe disappearing into the river. Tigerclaw nodded and looked at Graystripe.
"You'd better get yourself to Yellowfang before you freeze to death."
The ThunderClan deputy stood up and stalked away, and Fireheart breathed a sigh of relief. Graystripe didn't hesitate. The long run home hadn't stopped his teeth from chattering. He bounded away to Yellowfang's den. Brackenpaw glanced at Cinderpaw and padded off to his nest. his tail drooping with exhaustion. Fireheart looked at Cinderpaw. "Aren't you even a bit frightened by Tiger Claw?" he asked curiously.
"Why should I be?"
replied Cinderpaw.
"He's a great warrior. I admire him."
Of course, why shouldn't she? Fireheart thought. "You lie very well," he growled sternly, trying his best to act like a mentor.
"Well, I try not to.
Mewed Cinderpaw.
I just thought the truth wouldn't be very helpful here."
Fireheart had to admit she had a point. He shook his head slowly. "Go and get warm."
"Yes, Fireheart."
Cinderpaw dipped her head and charged after Brackenpaw. Fireheart padded over to the warrior's den. He was worried at how easily the story about Graystripe's soaking had tumbled from Cinderpaw's mouth. But he also believed she was a well-meaning and honest cat. He thought of Ravenpaw, another good cat. Had the story he'd told about Tiger Claw killing Redtail simply been just that? A story that tumbled from his mouth in the heat of the moment? Fireheart shook the thought away. Ravenpaw had been terrified when he spoke to Fireheart. He obviously believed his own story. Why else would he have been frightened enough to leave the clan? Fireheart chose a few pieces of fresh kill and carried them over to the nettle clump. He settled himself beside it and began to gnaw thoughtfully on a mouse. The admiration in Cinderpaw's voice when she had spoken of Tiger Claw worried him. It seemed as though he alone suspected there was more to the ThunderClan deputy than met the eye. Bluestar's attitude toward Tiger Claw certainly hadn't changed. She had been treating him with the same trust and respect that she had always shown him. With a flash of frustration, Fireheart ripped another mouthful from his meal. A loud sneeze made him look up. Graystripe was heading toward him. "How are you?" Fireheart asked as Graystripe arrived, smelling of one of Yellowfang's herb concoctions. Graystripe sat down heavily and coughed. "I've saved you some food," Fireheart meowed, pushing a plump thrush and a vole toward his friend. "Yellowfang says I have to stay in camp. She says I have a chill," Graystripe meowed thickly. "I'm not surprised. What did she dose you with?" "Feverfew and lavender." Graystripe lay down and began to nibble at the thrush. "This'll be enough for me," he mumbled. "I'm not very hungry." Fireheart looked at his friend in amazement. That wasn't something he had ever thought he'd hear Graystripe say. "You sure?" he asked. "There's plenty here." Graystripe stared down at the thrush and didn't reply. "Are you sure?" Fireheart repeated. "What?" Graystripe turned his faraway gaze on Fireheart. Yeah," he meowed. He must have a fever, Fireheart decided, shaking his head. Oh well, at least he was still here, thanks to that RiverClan cat. A few days later, Fireheart woke to find the first fog of leaf bear filling the den. When he crept outside, he could barely see the other side of the clearing. He heard paw steps hurrying toward him, and mouse fur appeared out of the gloom.
"Tiger Claw wants to see you,"
she meowed. "Right. Thanks," answered Fireheart. Alarm shot through him. He'd slipped away to visit Princess yesterday. Had Tiger Claw noticed? "What was that?" Graystripe's voice wheezed behind him. He sat down beside Fireheart, sneezed, and yawned. "Tiger Claw wants to see me." Fireheart looked at his friend. "You should be asleep." He was beginning to worry about Graystripe. He ought to have recovered by now. "Did you rest up yesterday?" he asked. "As much as I could between coughing and sneezing," complained Graystripe. "Then why weren't you in your nest when I got back from—" Fireheart hesitated, remembering he'd spent the afternoon talking with Princess. "Training." "Do you think I get any peace and quiet in there?" Graystripe flicked his head back at the den. "Warriors trooping in and out all day? I found somewhere quieter, that's all." Fireheart was about to ask where, but Graystripe spoke first. "I wonder what Tiger Claw wants." Fireheart's paws prickled. "I'd better go and find out." You could just see the shapes of Tiger Claw and Whitestorm through the mist, sitting below the high rock. As Fireheart padded over to them, They stopped talking, and Tigerclaw turned to him.
It's time Cinderpaw and Brackenpaw were assessed,
He growled. Already? Fireheart meowed in surprise. The apprentices had not been training long.
Blue Star wants to see how their training is progressing, especially with Graystripe being too ill to train Brackenpaw. If Brackenpaw is falling behind, she needs to know so she can appoint another mentor for him.
Fireheart's tail twitched with annoyance. Surely Graystripe would recover soon. It would be unfair to entrust his first apprentice to someone else. I've been taking Brackenpaw out with me and Cinderpaw every day, he meowed quickly. Tigerclaw glanced at Whitestorm and nodded.
Yes, but this is your first time as a mentor. It's a lot for you to take on, and ThunderClan needs well-trained warriors.
I know, and I'm just a kitty pet, not a clan-born warrior, Fireheart thought bitterly. He looked down at his paws, stinging with resentment. No one had asked him to take on Brackenpaw, and he'd been putting in a lot of effort with both apprentices. Tigerclaw went on.
Send Brackenpaw and Cinderpaw on a hunting mission through Tall Pines as far as Two Leg Place. Keep an eye on them, watch them hunt, and report to me. I'll be interested to see how much fresh kill they add to the pile.
Whitestorm added.
If Cinderpaw's skills match her enthusiasm, there should be plenty to eat tonight. I hear she is a keen apprentice.
Yes, she is, Fireheart agreed, though he was barely listening. Tigerclaw's words had set his heart racing. Why was Tigerclaw sending him to Two Leg Place again? His own hunting assessment had been held over exactly the same route, and Tigerclaw had seen him sharing words with an old kitty pet friend. He'd reported it to Blue Star, and she had questioned Fireheart's loyalty to the clan. Fireheart felt the fur along his spine begin to prickle. Was this Tigerclaw's way of warning him that he had been spotted talking to Princess? Fireheart twisted his head and gave his back a quick lick, brushing his bristling hairs flat with his tongue. He sat up straight again and calmly suggested, The Sunning Rocks would be an equally good place to test their skills. The sun there might have burned away some of this mist, too.
No,
growled Tigerclaw.
The Dawn Patrol reported scenting RiverClan at Sunning Rocks. They may have started hunting there again.
Anger flared in his eyes, and his lip curled to reveal sharp teeth.
They will need to be warned off before we do any more training there. For now, Tall Pines would be much safer for the assessment.
Whitestorm nodded in agreement, while Fireheart's ears twitched uncomfortably at this news. RiverClan at Sunning Rocks. It was lucky they hadn't been spotted by enemy patrols when Graystripe fell into the river.
As for the fog, Tigerclaw continued smoothly, hunting in difficult conditions will make the test more interesting.
Yes, Tigerclaw, meowed Fireheart, ducking his head respectfully to the two warriors. I'll tell Cinderpaw and Brackenpaw. We'll get started right away. When Fireheart explained the assessment to the apprentices, Cinderpaw flicked up her tail and ran in an excited circle.
An assessment! Do you think we're ready?
Of course, Fireheart meowed, hiding his doubts. You've been working hard and learning quickly.
But won't the fog make hunting difficult?
Asked Brackenpaw. Fireheart replied, There are advantages to the stillness of the air. Brackenpaw looked thoughtful. Then his eyes began to shine, and he mewed,
It'll be harder to sniff out prey, but it'll also make it harder for the prey to smell us.
Exactly, Fireheart agreed.
Shall we go now?
Cinderpaw asked. As soon as you like, answered Fireheart. But take your time. It's not a race. His words were wasted on Cinderpaw, who was already charging toward the camp entrance. You've got till sunset, he called after her. Brackenpaw glanced at Fireheart and turned to follow his sister with a small sigh. Fireheart tracked the two apprentices through the tall pines. The springy layer of pine needles under Paw felt strangely soft after the frozen ground in the rest of the forest. He followed Cinderpaw's trail until he could see her stalking eagerly through the forest. Then he picked up Brackenpaw's scent and followed that.
And while they're on the hunt, we'll take a little break. This is Warriors Fire and Ice by Aaron Hunter. And we're in Roblox with the Warrior Cats. Story's picked up. I didn't like the first couple of chapters, but things are happening now, so I like the character. I like the slow brooding character development. Don't like it when they hit you with too many things too quickly. But that's just me. All right, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, be cool. Stay safe. Take care. One love to y'all. And hopefully there'll be another stream soon.